So I can't really remember the first time I told a story, but I remember the first time a story stuck with me. When I was a kid, growing up in Oklahoma, every Saturday morning I would be in the bowels of the local library, just reading everything in sight. It was my happy place, my safe place. It was like a refuge for me where, the smell of musty books and nobody could find me. And when I was 13, I read a book many people probably remember, at least if you're a little older, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. And there was something about that story that so deeply resonated with me. I've reflected on it across the years, which I'll say a little bit about here in just a moment. But I don't know how many times I read that book. It was a transcendent experience for me. So in recent years especially, now I'm 68, so I'm far removed from 13, I've really been aware that there's something about the power of a transcendent story, something that speaks to our soul. There's a lot of research now as we get older that says that the final stage of our life, the last half of our life, which is actually a third, that it's called the soul's journey home. We're coming home to ourselves. And what I'm now realizing all these many years later is when I was 13, there was already a story speaking to my soul. And I guess that's so relevant for what we're doing here, because in the end, there's something about story that speaks deeply to us, resonates with us. And of course, when we begin to tell those stories, it hopefully resonates with an audience. But I know we're supposed to tell stories in the service of an audience, but it may actually be that we're telling the story in the service of us because it resonates for us and that resonance carries out. So Jonathan Livingston Seagull, it's a story about a seagull who just wants to fly like no other seagull has ever flown. And it's the story of him doing this, a very, very deep psycho-spiritual tale. And eventually, Jonathan becomes a master teacher. Jonathan becomes a transcendent being. And when people laugh, those who know me well, they say, "Yeah, Ron, you're like a wannabe spiritual teacher." And so, perhaps even at the age of 13, so many years ago, that story spoke deeply into my being, who I am, what my soul came here to do, assuming that's a thing that happens. Even now as I tell the story, I can feel it in my upper chest because of its resonance with me. It's literally a somatic experience in the story. So that's my earliest story.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And as we move along, one of the things I wanted to ask is if you would be able to, can you tell me something about the first time you performed a story? So now that we've heard about a story that was impactful for you as a child, thinking about as you got older and began to have opportunities to tell stories, I'd love to hear more about those times when you first started performing.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you the one that is most significant and probably very telling. I'm 39 years sober, recovering from alcoholism. And the first time I can really, really remember telling a story of impact was when I talked about my life getting sober. And the reason I remember it is because I have no idea. I told the story, it took me 50 minutes, so I said something, but I have no idea what I talked about. And I love that because it speaks to, at Moth, what we so often hear is, how people, we're nervous, right? We're standing there, we're revealing ourselves. And so in telling a recovery story, complete with all the awful, hideous pieces, you're putting yourself out there. So of course I would blank out and completely not remember it. But it was really interesting thereafter. It was shortly after that time that one of my spiritual advisors really encouraged me to get into Toastmasters, which is where I actively started telling stories. And in fact, the first speech competition I won as an adult was a storytelling competition. And then the second one was a tall tales competition. So, story was like bedrock for me. But it all started with that completely forgotten and perhaps, I don't know. People came up after I told my recovery story and they told me it was really great, but I don't remember any of it. So isn't that it? Our best stories are completely unremembered by us, which actually throws in a really funny point, Josh. I'll just say this real quick. The funny point it throws in is one of the wise elders in my life said, "Ron, sometimes our best communication will be when we do not know we're communicating well. So it's
Totally.
like, there we are, right? Yeah.
Yes. Well, and that was my experience too, because I only recently told a story on stage at the Moth. And so for me, when I came down, Hannah was with me, and she was like, well, how did you think it went? And I was like, I don't know. It felt good, but I don't really remember. It was
right.
almost an out-of-body experience. Yeah, totally.
They applauded. I must have said something.
Exactly. Well, to continue on, as far as performance goes, when you think about the audience and coming into whether it's Moth or Toastmasters or anywhere, how much of you thinking about who's going to be their influences, or again, kind of like you shared in your first story, was it really more for? Is it more for you, or are you thinking a lot about the audience?
A lot. Since I do some professional work, one of the things that was drilled into me is, I know we have stories to tell, and they're intensely personal. But in the end, if you're not thinking about how it best serves the audience, I really, it probably runs a little counter to the way the Moth thinks of it. This is like me telling my story. But if you're taking up stage time and you're not thinking about how you're going to do it in a way that's of service to the needs of the audience, I think it becomes kind of egocentric, self-centered. Sure. And so, I have been taught professionally, always think about the audience, think about how well it's going to communicate, how well they're going to take it home. It's the old value proposition for marketing, right? And there's actually, crossover to Toastmasters for one, there's actually a question in some of the competitive assessment that gets done that says, did this speaker's content warrant use of this stage and these people's time? Which of course is kind of like off the charts professional standard. Yeah. Am I delivering value to the audience? So I'm mindful of that. And so the magic is like, how do you take your unique story, unique contribution, and somehow or another dovetail it so it's beneficial to the listener?
Yeah.
And maybe that's unrealistic, but it sure seems to make sense to me.
Yeah, that's great. I know that a lot of people that also tell stories at the Moth are in the audience every week. And whether you're at Toastmasters or other places, I'm sure that there are storytellers in the audience. So when you think about your relationship with some of those other storytellers, whether it be from the Moth or Toastmasters or other places you've spoken, what comes to mind when you think about, in particular, the Atlanta storytelling community and some of the things that have been special or meaningful to you about that community?
Yeah. So I'm going to have a little fun with this one. It is a collection of some of those quirky people I have ever, it's just, It's such a mix, right? It's sort of a powerful statement, and I realize this will be a little bit political, but in the present environment, but it's such a statement of the power of diversity. So many unique stories, so many unique vantage points. And I'm not just talking about racial or ethnic diversity. I'm talking about that like gold standard that if you look at a forest untended, it's got all this stuff, all these shapes, all this stuff going on. And I kind of feel like the Moth audience in Atlanta, this is probably true in all Moth audiences, but it just represents a very curious cross-section of humanity. And so the result is that we've got all these different angles that are being presented. And sometimes the host will actually mention this, that you get 10 speakers on stage, and so you have no idea what all you're going to hear, because there's like all of these quirky views on the world. So I think that's the part that I most appreciate, because I think it's one of my longtime mentors said, when you get enough vantage points and you begin to see the world as a hologram, then you begin to see reality. And that quirky, unique vantage points allows me to see reality a little more effectively.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, just like my daughter and I, we've only been coming for about 6 months. And so it took me a few times to get the courage up to get on stage. And so for my daughter or other people who come on a regular basis who think that they would love to do it, what advice would you give to someone who's never done it before, who might want to get on stage and tell their story?
Well, one of the nice things about the Moth format is it's supportive no matter how you do. This last time there was a guy who kind of broke the rules and did something he wasn't supposed to do, and they had to and still it was highly supportive. So I think
Absolutely.
two things to say. Number one, it's an incredibly supportive environment. A friend said it's like sausage making. There's like all this, it's just this mashup.
Yes.
But the other thing is that what we know is that human history is about narrative, oral history, right?
Yeah.
And so there is something intrinsically human about telling our story, whatever our story is. And so that probably ends with a, just get up there and give it a try. You may be surprised by what you experience. More importantly, there's something about telling the story that reinforms the way we're living, right? There's something reinforcing about it. So I think it's an incredibly valuable thing to do. And sure, your hands will shake and your voice will quaver, and that's all totally okay.
Yeah, that's great. Totally true. Well, what's one story that you've always wanted to tell, but maybe haven't yet?
Actually, it's a story about my dad. My dad had a difficult life for all kinds of reasons, but when he died, we were in taking care of his affairs, and tucked away deep in the corner of a drawer in one of his dressers, there was an old yellowed newspaper clipping. And I mean, it jumped out at me immediately, and I thought, what is that doing back there? And it was a clipping of Teddy Roosevelt's speech that came to be called as the Man in the Arena. And basically, the short story for the Man in the Arena is like, the credit goes to the man who's in the arena, who's sweating and bloodied by the effort and may fail in the end, but it was a noble effort regardless. It's very Teddy Roosevelt-ish. And the thing that struck me was I'm looking at it and I went, oh my God, this is my dad's life. I'm going to cry. This is my dad's life story, right? And there's this question. It's like, well, did my dad read The Man in the Arena and become that? Or was he that and the man in the arena spoke to him? It was so meaningful because he had clipped it out and put it there. And so I was so struck by the whole thing that when we decided that we were going to try and figure out what to put on his headstone, we had that etched into the back of it because it was, and it's such a profound thing to wonder, do we live our way into the stories? Or do the stories live their way into us? And of course, there's no way to answer that. But it's a really provocative idea that somehow or another stories are part of the makeup of our being, one way or the other. And
Absolutely.
Powerful stuff.
Absolutely. Well, I've got one more for you, and then we'll be done. But
Okay.
But the last thing I wanted to hear from you about is just your journey, and is there anything about your journey or the storytelling world that you would want to share with somebody who might one day stumble across this video?
Yeah. So I'll cross a little bit into my professional world. I do a bunch of professional work as a facilitator, trainer, etc. And here's what we know. There's great research on this. Anything that is new to us is going to make us uncomfortable. If it's familiar, we're not uncomfortable. So here's why this matters. If you look at human development, if you look at what Maslow told us about, self-realization, it's about continuing to experience people, things, circumstances that are new, that stretch us into discomfort places. And, we've evolved to think that discomfort is to be avoided. But it's actually the place that it's called the growing edge now, right? And so the thing that has been most powerful for me, which I would encourage anybody, I continue, even though I've been working at storytelling for a very long time, I keep trying to push myself into places which make me uncomfortable because it means I'm on that valuable growing edge. Now, here's the punchline, right? When you look at the most vital, vibrant elders, they are people who are still living their way into uncomfortable places. They have not settled into an easy chair and just coasted. So you go, wow. So if you want to be vital and vibrant, if you want your life to add up to, if you want to be that 94-year-old people go, I want to talk to that guy. There's something powerful about getting really comfortable with putting yourself into your discomfort zones, because that's where all the cool stuff happens. And get on a stage, tell a story you didn't think you could tell, Make some stuff up that you just didn't imagine you could make up, because that in itself is promoting our vitality and our vibrancy, and ultimately, according to the psychologists, a fulfilled life. So might as well use stories to get us there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I've heard even recently several podcasts and different things talking about that very principle of leaning into the hard, because that's where the growth happens. And so thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being willing to come and do this interview and to be with us. And I'm so excited to continue to hear more of your stories from the stage at the Moth and then maybe other places as well. But I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Josh. It's been a real treat. Thanks for letting me be your guinea pig.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Sure enough.
All right. Thanks.